So, what makes a person happy? And is happy the same as blessed? The way we usually look at things, happiness is really sort of connected to what our current circumstances are. What's happening with me in the moment, maybe even right now. Sometimes happiness is just that something bad goes away, especially if we've been dealing with it for a while. Anybody else besides me be happy to not hear the word COVID or pandemic or variant for a while? I'm happy because the bad thing is gone. Now, that sort of happiness, while it's good, it makes you happy, it's short-lived. And it's short-lived because the world's just a really broken place. And when one bad thing goes away, usually pretty soon another one isn't all that far behind. Am I right? And it's kind of been that way ever since Adam and Eve first sinned. Sometimes happy comes from a more positive place. Sometimes happy comes from, well, I'm happy because I got what I wanted. I got the good grade. I got the promotion. I got more money. I got an upgrade. I got a makeover. I got some recognition. I got a new relationship, whatever. But that sort of happiness actually ends up being kind of fleeting too, doesn't it? Because you either worry about that something's going to be messing up those things, which inevitably seems to happen, or you get sort of stressed out over getting those things, or you get jealous when you look around and see that some other people have something that's a little better than you've got, or self-first puts you on sort of a collision course with other self-first people, and that ends up getting more than a little messy. So whether it's bad stuff ending or good stuff happening, happiness that's connected to our circumstances seems sort of like a vapor on the wind. And yet, we just keep plowing down that path right along with everybody else as if there's no other alternative. I mean, and we keep at it, and we keep at it, and we keep at it, because even if it doesn't seem to bring the results that we want, that's the way we seem to be wired to approach life. Right? We live as if now is all that matters, and as if things are the end-all, the be-all of life, and as if the me of the moment is more important than anyone and anything else. Enter Jesus, the teacher. And Jesus, the teacher, here suggests an alternative, suggests what I'll call it a countercultural lifestyle, who points out that there is, in fact, another way, and actually a better way, a reversal of our normal way of thinking that leads us to find happiness. And Jesus calls it blessedness, this reversal of our normal way of thinking, so that what Jesus is teaching is that the way to find happiness is not in our current and ever-changing circumstances, but it's in the condition that we find our hearts in, and how closely we find our heart beating in rhythm with God's. That's when Jesus says we find greater blessing in our lives. And it's when we find ourselves also being a greater blessing to the people around us too. We're going to look at 3 short chunks of Jesus' teaching from Luke chapter 6 that give us 3 principles to build on if we want to go in that direction. Let's dig in.
Jesus looked at his disciples and said, "Blessed are those who are poor. God's kingdom is theirs. Blessed are those who are hungry. They will be satisfied. Blessed are those who are crying. They will laugh."
Now, when you first hear those verses, it's kind of like, huh? What's Jesus talking about here? He's been out in the wilderness too long, maybe even eating some strange wilderness food. I mean, how out of touch can you be? What's the blessing in being poor? Not sure I can think of any. What's the blessing in being hungry? Sounds like more of a curse to me. What's the blessing in crying, in grieving, in having a broken heart? That's a place you want to get out of, not a place you want to stay in. It's like if that's where Jesus is going to start out, holding up poverty and hunger and grief as virtues, it's like I'm not sure I want to listen to this anymore. I like money. I like nice things. I like food. And I much prefer being happy to being sad. Why would I pursue any of that? Why would I pursue the opposite of that? Well, perhaps because there's a deeper meaning and a significance to what Jesus is saying here than you see at first glance. See, Jesus isn't giving us a tweet or a sound bite or even a point-by-point bullet plan to find happiness. Instead, what Jesus is teaching here is he's teaching some deep, abiding principles. Deep, abiding principles that are going to help us find the blessedness and even some of the happiness that we're after. And Jesus here isn't saying that things or money or food or happiness are bad. What he's doing is reminding us that those things are temporary and transitory. And he's pushing us to look for more. To look for more and something that's going to lead us to better, both for us and for other people. So here's the principle that he's talking about. The principle here is walk humbly. Well, walk humbly, which it's not very cultural, is it? I mean, society doesn't seem to think much of humility. People spend a lot of time walking around proudly saying, well, here I am, trying to prove their worth to others, trying to show how important they are, trying even to tell God how much good they've done and how they deserve a seat at the table. What happens with that? Proud people often butt into each other, right? And messes come as a result of that, messes all over the place. Am I right? Well, Jesus teaches us here that humility actually leads us to a better and more fulfilling place. And not just in eternity, but now. Now, Jesus' friend Matthew helps us understand a little more of what Luke's writing here and how it's those steps into walking in humility. Because Matthew wrote down a little more than Luke did. As we get into what Matthew said, we're going to help us see that Jesus here is just pushing us to see that he's not talking about blessedness or happiness in terms of things. He's talking about the things that are important to us, like money and food and happiness, in a way that's sort of shocking, so that we'll think longer and deeper and go on to discover this countercultural truth he's trying to teach, that there's blessedness in much more than the big three of food and money and a relatively happy and pain-free life. So here's how Matthew fleshes out what Luke's telling us in shorthand form. Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now see how that helps us understand what Luke recorded? Blessed are not the poor economically, but blessed are the poor in spirit. What he's saying here is that Jesus is talking about heart condition, about spiritual things as the way to blessedness. So when he says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, he's saying those are the people who are poor in spirit who are emptying themselves of their self-importance and self-deception and self-delusion and self-righteousness. And they acknowledge instead that they're in fact by nature spiritually poor, spiritually bankrupt, that they need God. That they need God in their lives, that you don't really have anything that lasts without God. When you recognize that, when you walk that humbly, that's when he says God starts to fill you up. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Remember, Matthew's showing us that Jesus is talking about spiritual things, a condition of the heart. And so he's not talking about here, Jesus isn't saying that it's a blessed experience to be grieving or crying over our hurts. That would be just like weird and strange, wouldn't it? What he's saying is, we find a condition of blessedness when we have a grief or sorrow over sin. When we have a grief or sorrow over what we've done wrong, that we're not trying to excuse it or ignore it or sweep it under the rug or laugh it off or revel in it. Instead, we realize how destructive our mistakes are, how destructive sin is to our relationships, both with God and with other people. And we grieve over that, we cry over that, and that's when we're comforted. Because when we say, God, I'm sorry, why did I do that? Please forgive me. He comforts us when we find that he does, that he forgives us, that he cleanses our sin, that he helps us start fresh. And blessed are those who hunger. Well, Matthew says again, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Again, Jesus isn't saying here that there's a blessing in being physically hungry. What he's saying is there's blessing in hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Now see, culture does things its own way, doesn't it? And it's often not very pretty. In fact, it's often pretty messy. It's pretty messy because me first usually ends up with a bunch of other me's first people like butting heads. Jesus says here there's a different way, and there's a better way. Blessed are those not whose stomachs are growling because they need something to eat, but blessed are those who hunger and thirst for God's way, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who hunger and thirst for a conformity to God's will and doing the right things and doing right by others, who hunger and thirst for that, kind of like a hungry person sitting down at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Right? That's when you're blessed. And it takes humility to get to those places. So that's the first big principle Jesus is teaching us here in his countercultural way of ordering our lives. Walk humbly. Now, before we get on to the next countercultural principle that Jesus is teaching us, let's think about that for a minute and how it applies to our own lives. Hit pause and take a few minutes to reflect on which of these three we've just talked about is most challenging to you, and why? Is it being poor in spirit and emptying yourself of your self-delusion? Is it grieving over your sin instead of making excuses? Or is it hungering for God's way more than your own way? Which of those is most challenging to you right now, and why? Go ahead and talk about that right now.
But I tell everyone who is listening, love your enemies. Be kind to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who insult you.
The principle Jesus is teaching us there is love unconditionally. Love unconditionally. See, what passes for love in the world today is mostly the opposite of that. Mostly conditional stuff. I mean, we love people because, well, we love the people we like. We love the people who like us. We love people who can do things for us. We love people that we think can help us get somewhere. We love people who make us feel happy. We love as long as we're feeling happy or lovey. We love as long as you make me happy, and if you don't, or I don't feel happy anymore, well, I'm on to someone or something else, or at least I'm emotionally out of there. That's how things seem to work in our world for a whole lot of people. Lots of conditions and lots of actions based on feelings. And one of the big problems with that is feelings change. All right, conditions change a lot. So it's going to be pretty hard to find happiness for any length of time when your basing your love on those sort of conditions, much less get to this state that Jesus calls blessedness. So by saying love your enemies here, what Jesus is doing is taking love to a completely different level. That's totally countercultural. Some might even say it's unnatural. Unnatural because by saying love your enemies, Jesus makes love totally unconditional. Because, well, you don't like your enemies, do you? They don't like you either. And you don't generally do things for your enemies, do you? The only things they do for you is give you hurt. If there's anything you feel like doing, it's hurting them back. You don't feel like doing anything for them either. I know I don't. Sometimes the hardest walk is the one across the room or across the parking lot to try to talk to somebody that you don't even want to see. All right? Love your enemies means love without conditions. Love even when you don't feel like it. Love without keeping score or counting the cost. Love even when it hurts because they're hurting you. Perhaps that's part of the reason the first principle Jesus taught us was walk humbly. Because it really takes a lot of humility to get to that spot when you can start to love unconditionally. And then because Jesus actually wants us to do this, not just to think about it or talk about it, he actually wants us to love unconditionally. He actually shows us some things we can do. He gives us some examples that we can do to take us steps in loving unconditionally. Verse 27, he says, be kind. All right, that's simple kindness, gentleness, civility, graciousness, especially with your words. Again, it's that going across the room and having a polite conversation, maybe with someone you didn't even want to see there. So he says, be kind. Next word, verse 28, he says is, bless those who curse you, whether it's in person or whether it's on social. Bless those who curse you. Again, say kind things about people and be silent if you don't feel that you can say something kind. As Martin Luther said, put the best construction on everything. What Jesus says here, bless those, that word bless that he uses in Greek literally means good words. He's saying good words. Say good words about people, like the eulogy that you do at a funeral. And then the end of verse 28, he says, pray for those who insult you. So bless, be kind, bless, say good words, and pray for those who insult you. Not pray against them, but pray for them. That's how you take steps into loving unconditionally. It's hard, but that's unconditional love. Love, no exceptions.
Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will never be judged. Stop condemning, and you will never be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and you will receive. A large quantity, pressed together, shaken down, and running over, will be put into your pocket. The standards you use for others will be applied to you. Jesus also gave them this illustration. Can one blind person lead another? Won't both fall into the same pit? A student is no better than his teacher, but everyone who is well trained will be like his teacher. Why do you see the piece of sawdust in another believer's eye and not notice the wooden beam in your own eye? How can you say to another believer, "Friend, let me take the piece of sawdust out of your eye," when you don't see the beam in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, remove the beam from your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the piece of sawdust from another believer's eye.
So Jesus has taught us to walk humbly and taught us to love unconditionally. Well, this third thing he's teaching us is to act mercifully. And like love unconditionally, that's really hard. Because our culture these days seems much more wired to focus on fairness and justice. And if you feel you've been wronged, to strike back, and to strike back sort of with an eye for an eye. And if you have either the power or the platform, and with social, everybody's got a platform these days. And if you have that power platform and you feel like you're in the right, there's not a lot of mercy for the other side, is there? Not a lot of engagement or conversation or listening either, just harshness. The feeling's more, I'm right, or I'm in the right, and you're wrong, or you're in the wrong. And I'm going to treat you harshly by what I say to you, by what I say about you, by what I act toward you. I mean, that's just mainstream culture today. And unfortunately, from one person's perspective, I think that's also marched right into the church. And a lot of church people are marching right lockstep with that same harsh culture. I mean, think about it. How much railing about how bad other people are you hearing from church people these days? And how much talking about the things they don't like in other church people are you hearing from church people these days? And how much complaining about how could a Christian think like that, or how could they vote like that, are you hearing from Christians these days? How much is politics and practice being elevated to doctrine? How much harshness is out there for people whose beliefs aren't like 99% pure and in line with my beliefs? It doesn't seem to be a lot of room for people that still have questions. I mean, I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a young mom not too long ago. We ended with her kind of asking, well, what's with all these judgy Christians? And the thing is, she's a Christian. And she's not living outside of what you'd call the moral code. She's just a Christian with some questions. One who doesn't have all the answers, and one who feels judged when she goes to her little Bible group and she doesn't have all the answers, or she comes up with a wrong answer. She still asks a question, and it's just like, what's with all these judgy Christians? Why are they making me feel like I'm not right enough? I don't think that's an experience that's confined to her. I mean, that's a very important question to focus on. What's with all these judgy Christians? It seems like even in the church, it's harder and harder to find grace and mercy these days. It seems like harshness, on the other hand, that seems to be found all over the place. But let me ask you this. Does harshness really lead to happiness? Does harshness really lead to happiness? I don't think so. I mean, when you're harsh, what are you feeling? The overwhelming feeling when you're harsh is anger or frustration or exasperation, isn't it? not happiness and blessedness. What Jesus is teaching, act mercifully, is a better way. Mercy is a better way. It's a better way for your own emotional well-being. It's a better way for other people's sake. It's a better way for culture's sake. It's a better way for the church's sake. And it's especially a better way because Jesus is actually teaching us that acting mercifully, it's God's way. It's God's heart. Let me take you back to what he says again. Verse 36, be merciful as your Father is merciful. What he's saying there is love and mercy is at the heart of God. And in case you've been thinking of God a little differently than that lately, let me give you some other Bible on that. Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. Then he, meaning God, passed in front of Moses, calling out, the Lord, a compassionate and merciful God, patient, always faithful and ready to forgive. Nehemiah 9, verse 17, you are a God of forgiveness, gracious and merciful, slow to become angry and rich in unfailing love. You did not abandon them. Psalm 103, verse 8 to 10. The Lord is compassionate and merciful, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. He will not constantly accuse us, nor remain angry forever. He does not punish us for all our sins. He does not deal harshly with us as we deserve. In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22 and 23, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now there's a whole lot more, but you see what those are saying? They're saying God's heart is mercy. God's heart is love. God's heart is grace. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And then again, just like he wanted to give us ways that we can love unconditionally, Jesus here wants us to do this, not just think about it. So he tells us some actual steps we can take to move in that direction. To stop doing this and to start doing this. The stop doing this, verse 37. Stop judging and stop condemning. Again, are you really happy when you're judging others? You may feel superior, but are you happy? Or are you just angry and frustrated? Is that the more prevalent emotion there? And if it is, how is that a good thing? Right? And think about that conversation I had with that young mom again. Can't we just give people some space to wrestle with their questions, to work through them, to not have all the answers right away? I mean, isn't that how we find Jesus acting toward people, especially outside the church or on the margins, with love and mercy and gentleness and compassion? When Jesus says that here, that he's teaching us that when your judging or condemning spirit rises up and you feel that happening, he says, just stop it. Don't give voice to what you're thinking. Don't give voice to what you're thinking, and that's really hard because that's the norm in society these days again. But here's how you begin to stop judging and condemning. Down in verse 41, Jesus says this, why do you see the piece of sawdust in another believer's eye and not notice the wooden beam in your own eye? What Jesus is saying is when you start to feel that judging and condemning spirit rise up in you, and you can sense when that's happening and what you're about to say, Jesus says just take a deep breath and stop and look at yourself first and work on yourself first and ask for forgiveness for your own stuff, including the judgy attitude. Ask for forgiveness for that first, right? Not only is that part of walking humbly, principle number one, not only does that keep me from being a hypocrite, it's also really practical. Because, frankly, I have enough trouble managing me and improving my own behavior without complicating that by trying to manage a whole bunch of other people's lives. Okay, that's the stop doing this and the steps into that. The start doing this, well, verse 37, he says, forgive. See, it's pretty hard to keep judging and condemning someone when you're forgiving them. And then verse 38, he says, give. See, generosity has a way of building a joyful spirit. And a joyful heart generally tends to put the best construction on everything and kind of pushes judginess way into the background. Now again, this is another challenging teaching. Not because we don't understand what Jesus is saying, but because we find it hard to put it into practice. So again, before we move on, let's take a little bit of time to examine how that's working out in my own life. Pause and reflect on this. What is it that tends to trigger that judging spirit in you? And what have you found helpful in stopping that judging spirit from coming out? Go ahead and think about that and talk about it right now. Well, this certainly is a countercultural way of life that Jesus is teaching us to pursue. Walk humbly, love unconditionally, and act mercifully. That doesn't seem to be a way that in our world should lead to happiness, at least not according to our culture. But you know what? The more that I've pursued that path, the more I've pursued walking humbly and loving unconditionally and acting mercifully, the more I find that it does, no matter what it is that's going on around me. And I think perhaps that's because living this way, well, it's what Jesus was like. See, Jesus doesn't just teach us the way. Jesus showed us the way. Jesus himself walked in humility from the moment when he was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger to the day when he allowed himself to be whipped and beaten and stripped naked and nailed to a cross. Jesus himself loved unconditionally, wading into other people's messy lives and willingly dying for us while we were still sinners, while we were still his enemies, while we still weren't taking a step in his direction. That's unconditional love. And Jesus himself acted mercifully, continually talking and eating with people that nobody else would, and helping and healing people who others walked on by or considered to be outcasts or undesirables, and not holding people's past or past mistakes against them. That's Jesus. In fact, I challenge you, go ahead and in the month or two ahead, read the stories of Jesus' life in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, and see how many examples you find of Jesus walking in humility and loving unconditionally and acting mercifully. God's like that. And Jesus teaches us here that when we live like that, we find greater blessing in our lives too. And we're also a bigger blessing to other people around us. We're a bigger blessing to other people in our lives when we lead with humility, when we lead with love, when we lead with mercy, and when we lead by example. We don't just preach a better way, we actually show a better way. And you know what? When you do that, what you find is you're becoming a little more like Christ. And then you might even find yourself having a little more influence with those on the margins. I keep saying it, but it's true. People don't line up to be judged. but they might line up to be loved. In fact, they will line up to be loved. So walk humbly, love unconditionally, act mercifully. And here's one more benefit when we do that. When we do that, we also might find more of that elusive thing that we call happiness. Not because we're getting a reward for being good and doing it right and living right, but simply because we're living more like Jesus. And that's its own reward. That salt is a foundation. It's a foundation that outlasts whatever storms that life can throw at us. Now, more on how to build on that foundation in Sunday's on-site message as we look at how Jesus wraps up here in Luke chapter 6. You can catch it in person, or you can go to the podcast section of our website, and that'll be up for you on Monday.